How's it going, YouTube? Today I will be discussing Russian politics and the reason why they're going to become more and more relevant to the international community as time progresses. Because ideologically, if we think about it, my generation, which is the mid-90s generation, is the first generation that hasn't really embraced communism as part of a political ideology, right? We are the first generation that was born after communism fell. And with that being said, and keeping that in mind, let's look at a couple of reasons as to why the way Russia will actually interact in terms of the international community in the near future will actually be highly significant and highly different from the way it not only interacted 10 years ago, but also the way it interacts now. Let's take America, for example. America was well known for being the police state. America was well known for just going in to every country that it actually chose to and install democracy or do anything in order to preserve its national ideas, while the Red Scare was going on, while the Cold War was going on, while the nuclear deterrence theory first started to emerge. And now that there's also more nuclear states, the fall of US hegemony already started to occur, right? We can see now in the 21st century that America can't just do whatever it wants anymore. It can't just overall go in any country and install some sort of military occupation without having some sort of approval, a multilateral approval of the international community. Of course, people might just bring Iraq and Iran. However, I'm trying to stay as up to date as possible and take Syria, for example, because Obama actually had to get the okay of Russia before it actually even considered bombarding, before it was even able to have some sort of like unilateral move in terms of how they interact with the Syrian chemical warfare issue. And so we can clearly see that Russia already started to become relevant, right? Putin already has a word in terms of how America is going to interact with the rest of the world. America can't just go ahead and do whatever it wants anymore, right? It's sort of this whole idea that as time progresses, we'll end up in a multipolar world, and a lot of international theorists, such as Joseph Nye, bring up India and China because of their rising economic power. However, I believe we also have to take a look at Russia because it was not only a strong entity during the Cold War, but even today it still has a lot of relevance, not only in the EU, but also in the international community and the United Nations. Second of all, we have to look at the way international policy works from an economic standpoint when looking at today's Russia. And we have to conclude that it's quite relevant, at least in Eastern Europe, for example. The last significant move that Putin has done in order to prove Russian political relevance was to give power to the Russian oligopolies in a manner in which they can screw over any other company in Eastern Europe as long as they preserve and secure the GDP growth in Russia. So we can see all these random oil companies and manufacturing companies that go out throughout Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, that are able to make a really long profit while abusing the idea of capitalism that you don't really have to pay a fair amount of money in order to get the product that you want. It's kind of the equivalent that the United States does in India, China, or Mexico, this outsourcing job kind of thing, that Russia already started to go and start imperializing the Eastern European side of the continent. So therefore, we can also conclude that economically speaking, Russia is also trying to make some sort of capitalist progress in terms of how their international policy and marketing will work further on. Also, we have to look at the social liberal aspect of Russia. Russia right now is as liberal as it ever was, probably in the entire history of the country. Because if we look at communism, it's a very socially conservative, strict environment. And even today, with the gay social policies, we can clearly see that my generation is willing to stand up for it. And it's not only my generation, of course. There's still people that are from my parents' generation and so on that also stand up for this idea that social liberalism and social progress has to happen in Russia, right? We saw actually what happened when Putin actually declared that gay rights will be extremely inexistent, rather, in Russia in the modern times. People actually stood up and they protested all over the place. We can see that there's people that are not willing to put up with social conservatism anymore. And this is obviously going to spill over in the future. I mean, this is just the bare start. If they already were able to show social movements in the current strict Russian state, we can see later on, once my generation will be able to actually hold office, that overall things will get better. Things will actually start to progress more, and that will overall increase the relevance of Russian politics, because once you have a strong socially liberal state, other policies will follow that will be able to somehow have a link to the things that we already observe right now. And also look at my notes. Another thing that I would like to touch on is inherently the fact that my generation is the first generation in Russia that was not raised in a communistic state. It's the first generation in probably 4 or 5 generations that did not have to deal with any sort of communistic overall policies. I mean, we've heard about it, we've talked about it, people still talk about it, there's still people that still advocate communism in Russia, and overall in Eastern Europe, there's still a lot of ex-communist states of Romania and ex-Yugoslavs that still believe that communism is the best alternative to our modern interpretation of capitalism, and that's fine. But we can see that people want change in Russia, especially people that were not really raised in a communistic state, people that see the way our grandparents and some of our parents interact and respond to implementation of economic policies that somehow have some sort of communistic nature to them, and take this radical shift to it and conclude that the communistic policies are actually not a good idea. For the following reasons, Russia is actually going to become a strong state and a future probably global hegemon in the international political community. Once again, people brought up China and India before because of their strong economic development. But we still have to look at Russia as a strong competitor. It still has nukes. It still has political relevance in terms of the international community. Their vote still matters in the Security Council. And my generation overall was not raised, again, in a political discourse where communism is the status quo. We're raised in a place of constant change. Things are constantly changing right now because of networking, because of globalism. Things happen, things change. And they'll just probably end up having some sort of strong impact in terms of the way people will interact with the Russian state probably 20 to 30 years from now. Okay,